The dress cost $412, and Nora had paid for it herself. That was the part that kept coming back to her, standing in the hallway outside the reception hall with her heels in one hand and her phone screen cracked from where she'd dropped it on the marble floor. $412. 2 months of picking up extra shifts at the accounting firm, skipping lunches, telling herself it would be worth it. She had the receipt somewhere. She had receipts for everything. It was the one skill her mother said she'd inherited from her father before he left. This compulsive need to write things down, to keep a running tally of what was owed and what had been paid. She hadn't written down what tonight was supposed to cost her. The ballroom behind her was still full. She could hear the music through the doors, something soft and string-heavy that the wedding coordinator had picked out after Nora told her she didn't have strong opinions about music. She'd had strong opinions about the flowers. She'd had strong opinions about the centerpieces and the seating chart and the exact wording of the vows. And none of that had mattered in the end, because 30 minutes ago she had walked into the wrong room. The coat check. She'd been looking for the coat check and found her fiancé with his hands in her maid of honor's hair. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the doorway and looked at them, and the first thing she thought, which she was not proud of, was, "I'm going to have to return the centerpieces." Her name was Nora Beckett, and she was 28 years old, and she had been engaged to Cole Hartman for 2 years, and she had been in love with him for 3 before that, and she had spent 5 years building something that turned out to be entirely one-sided. She understood that now. She understood it the way you understood a column of numbers that finally balanced. Suddenly, completely, with a finality that felt more like verdict than revelation. Cole had followed her out of the coat check saying her name, Nora. Nora, wait. Nora, listen. She had not waited. She had not listened. She had walked through the reception hall with her bouquet still in her hands and found the first exit she could, which turned out to be a side door that led to a hallway that led to nowhere in particular, and that was where she was now. Nowhere in particular, with her shoes off and her mascara not yet running, because she had not yet cried. She was not going to cry here. She was going to find her coat, get her car from the valet, and drive to her apartment, which was technically their apartment, but which Cole had moved into 2 years ago, so it had been her apartment first, and she was going to sit on the kitchen floor with a glass of wine and look at the spreadsheet she'd made of their shared expenses and figure out what he owed her. It would be a long spreadsheet. She was calculating the first line item, security deposit, split 60-40 because he made more than her that year, but she'd had it first. When the door at the far end of the hallway opened, she assumed it was Cole. She turned to say something she hadn't decided on yet, something cold and precise, something that would make it clear she was not devastated. She was done, which was a different thing entirely, and stopped. It was not Cole. The man who walked through the door was tall enough that he had to angle slightly to clear the frame, which he did without seeming to notice it. He was wearing a suit that Nora's accounting brain automatically categorized as bespoke, charcoal gray with a barely-there pinstripe, the kind of suit that was never on a rack anywhere. His hair was dark and cut close on the sides, and there was a scar along his jaw that looked old enough to have stopped bothering him years ago. He had the face of a man who had made a great many decisions that other people had to live with. He did not look at her the way men usually looked at women they found crying in hallways. He looked at her the way you looked at a problem you hadn't anticipated. Behind him, 2 men in similar suits stopped in the doorway and stayed there. Not bodyguards, exactly, more like punctuation. The Hartman event, the man said. It wasn't a question. Hartman Beckett, Nora said, and then felt immediately ridiculous, because who was she correcting right now? Yes. He looked at her for a moment, at the bouquet she was still holding, at her heels dangling from her hand, at whatever her face was doing that she couldn't quite control. "You're the bride." "I was," she said. "I'm reconsidering my options." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite anything she could name. "Voss," he said. She blinked. "Excuse me, my name." He said it like it was a thing he'd given her, not just information. Dorian Voss. She had heard that name before. She worked in corporate accounting. She had clients who got nervous at that name in ways they tried to hide, the way you tried to hide being nervous around very large dogs. Dorian Voss ran something that was called a private equity firm in the business filings, and was called something else entirely in conversations that happened in quieter rooms. Nora Beckett, she said, because apparently they were doing introductions. I know who you are. He said it simply, without inflection. Your firm handles the books for 3 of my holding companies. She stared at him. Your Ardent Capital, among other things. She had spent the last 8 months untangling the accounting for Ardent Capital's subsidiary acquisitions. She had built a 47-tab spreadsheet. She had sent 17 emails to a woman named Mrs. Park who answered questions in the fewest possible words and had never once mentioned that the man behind the company looked like this. What are you doing here? She asked. Hartman owes me something, Voss said. I came to collect. There was a pause. Through the wall, she could hear the string music change tempo. Someone would be looking for her soon. Cole's mother, probably, or the wedding coordinator, who had strong opinions about timeline. He cheated on me, Nora said. She didn't know why she said it. She was not the kind of person who told strangers things. With my maid of honor, 40 minutes ago, in the coat check. Voss looked at her steadily. I know, she blinked. You know, I know a great many things about Cole Hartman, he said. That's why I'm here. His 2 men stepped aside to let someone pass. A woman in a dark blazer carrying a folder who handed it to Voss without looking at Nora and then stepped back. Voss opened the folder, glanced at the top page, and held it out. Nora looked at it for a long moment before she took it. It was a financial summary. She recognized the format. She used a similar one for client audits. But the numbers were Cole's company, Cole's personal accounts, the investment fund he'd started 2 years ago with 3 of his college friends. The fund that he'd told her was picking up momentum. The fund that he'd borrowed $40,000 from her savings to invest in, which she had agreed to because she loved him and believed in him and had run the numbers herself. And they had not seemed right, actually. She had mentioned it once and he'd told her she was being too conservative, too cautious, too Nora about it, which was a thing he said when he wanted her to stop using her brain. She read to the 3rd page, then the 4th. He's been moving money, she said. For 14 months, Voss said. To an offshore account. She looked up. This is the account of a shell company registered in. She scanned the header. The Cayman Islands. The shell company is held by a man named Preston Gale, Voss said. Who is the brother of your maid of honor? Nora stood very still. She thought about the last 14 months. The new apartment Cole had wanted to get. The vacation to Portugal he'd suggested, and then pulled back on without explanation. The $40,000. The way he'd started coming home later, and she'd told herself it was the fund, it was momentum, it was the natural rhythms of a startup investment, and she understood those because she worked in finance and she was not paranoid. She was a forensic accountant who had been laundering money for her own fiancé and hadn't seen it coming. She almost laughed. It came out wrong. How much? She asked. Total moved from the fund. Just under $2 million. How much of that is mine? 40,000 directly. More if you include the 18 months of income you paid into your shared accounts while he was diverting the equivalent. She did the math automatically. It took about 4 seconds. $106,000, she said. Voss looked at her with something that might, on a less controlled face, have been respect, give or take. The door at the other end of the hallway opened. Cole appeared, still in his tuxedo, his bow tie slightly loosened, looking the way he always looked when he knew he'd miscalculated but hadn't decided on his story yet. He saw Nora. He saw Voss. His face went through several emotions very quickly and settled on the one that Nora recognized as his talking his way out face. Nora, he started. Mr. Hartman? Voss said. Cole stopped. He looked at Voss the way people looked at Voss apparently, with the recognition of something large and unavoidable. Dorian. He said the name carefully. This isn't. I can explain the fund situation if you'll give me a chance to. I'm not here about the fund, Voss said. Cole blinked. Then what? I'm here about Miss Beckett. There was a pause. Nora looked at Voss. She had the strange sensation of watching a card game from behind someone's shoulder, not quite seeing the hand but starting to understand the stakes. I have a proposal, Voss said, and he was looking at her when he said it, not Cole. Later, she would tell herself that she'd been in shock, that it was the only explanation for why she'd stood in a hotel hallway with her shoes in one hand and a fraudulent financial document in the other, and listened to a man she'd met 11 minutes ago describe what he wanted from her. Voss was tidy about it. She would give him that. He didn't dress it up. His legal team was in the middle of an acquisition, a company called Meridian Holdings, which was embedded enough in legitimate finance that the deal required a specific compliance structure, a compliance structure that was easier for a variety of reasons, both legal and interpersonal, if Voss appeared to be a settled man, a married man, someone whose personal life would not attract scrutiny from the board members, who were already nervous about the reputation that followed Dorian Voss through every room he walked into. You want a wife, Nora said. I want someone who already knows the Ardent Capital accounts, Voss said, who is credible in financial environments, who has reason enough to make a decision quickly. He paused, and who, as of 40 minutes ago, has no particular incentive to stay. She looked at him for a long moment. How long? 12 months. The acquisition closes in October. There'll be a 6-month integration period after that for appearances. You would have full access to the Ardent accounts during that time. Your own work, your own salary, negotiated separately. And Cole, my attorneys will handle the recovery of your losses, Voss said, plus interest. She looked at Cole, who was standing very still in the hallway and saying nothing, which was unusual enough that she clocked it as meaningful. Cole always had something to say. The fact that he had nothing right now meant he understood something about Dorian Voss that she was only beginning to. I want the 47-tab spreadsheet I built for Ardent Capital's subsidiary acquisitions, she said. You're missing a reconciliation error on the third holding that's going to cost you when the auditors look at Q3. Voss regarded her. I'm aware of the error. Then you know it's about a $30,000 discrepancy if someone looks at it wrong. Yes, I can fix it in 2 hours. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything that had a name. Then fix it. She didn't go back to the reception. She left the building through the same side door, with Voss's card in her clutch, and a car waiting at the curb that one of his men had apparently arranged, without her noticing when that happened. She sat in the back of the town car and looked at her phone, and thought about everything she would have to undo. The venue deposit, non-refundable. The florist, who might give her back 60% if she called before Monday. The hotel block she'd reserved for out-of-town guests. The honeymoon she'd half-planned in a shared Google Doc that Cole still had access to. She opened her notes app and started a new list. Things to cancel, things to reclaim, things that were hers. The car moved through the city, and the lights outside the window went from Hotel District Gold to the quieter, more practical lights of the financial district, and she watched them and thought about 12 months. 12 months was not forever. 12 months was a line item on a spreadsheet. She had managed the books for stranger arrangements than this. She had never been part of the arrangement, but there was a first time for everything. She met with Voss's attorney, a woman named Claudine Farr, who had the kind of face that had learned not to react to anything. 3 days later, in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building Nora had walked past 100 times without knowing it was his. The contract was 40 pages. She read all of them. This clause, she said, pointing to page 12, this limits my ability to discuss any Ardent Capital business with outside parties. That includes regulators. Claudine looked at her without blinking. Yes, I'm not signing anything that bars me from a legal obligation to report fraud, Nora said. If I find something in the accounts that I'm required by law to report, I report it. That's non-negotiable. Claudine made a note. I'll take it back to Mr. Voss. The clause was removed the next morning. No pushback, no counteroffer, Just gone. She noted that too. She moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Cole on a Thursday, while he was at a mediation meeting with Voss's attorneys that he'd been strongly encouraged to attend. She took her books and her kitchen things and the print of a Hopper painting that she'd bought with her first real paycheck and that Cole had always said made the living room feel sad. She left the furniture because most of it was his taste, and she'd been telling herself she liked it for 3 years. The sublet she moved into was small and bare and had a west-facing window that let in good light in the evenings, and was the first place she'd lived in 5 years where everything in it belonged to her. She saw Voss 11 times in the first month. She kept count. 3 of those were for the Meridian acquisition, meetings where she sat beside him and spoke when she was expected to speak, and watched the way he moved through rooms full of powerful men as though he had constructed the rooms himself. He never raised his voice. He never looked uncertain. He had a way of letting silences grow until other people filled them, which they always did, always with more than they'd meant to say, and she filed that away as something worth studying. 4 were social appearances, a charity gala, 2 dinners, 1 afternoon event at a gallery that he left after 40 minutes without explanation, and she followed because she didn't know what else to do. At all 4 of them, people watched her with exactly the mix of curiosity and calculation she'd expected. Who is she? Where did she come from? What does she have that makes her worth Voss's time? She smiled at the right moments and said little, and thought about the reconciliation error she'd fixed in the Ardent accounts, and the 3 additional discrepancies she'd found while she was in there. The other 4 were unexpected. One was a Tuesday morning when she came into the Ardent offices to review a set of contracts and found him already in the conference room, alone without his phone, looking out at the city. He didn't hear her at first. She watched him for a moment before she knocked on the glass. He turned, and his face did the thing it sometimes did when he was recalibrating, a half-second of something unguarded before the composure settled back in. "You're early," he said. "You're earlier," she said. She set up her laptop, and they worked in the same room for 3 hours. And he asked her twice what she thought about specific clauses, and listened to her actual answers, which she noted because most men in his position listened the way they skimmed documents, for the parts that confirmed what they already thought. In the second month, she found the second set of books. She wasn't looking for them. She was untangling a misfiled transaction in one of the subsidiary accounts when she noticed the coding structure, a specific sequence that shouldn't have appeared in that column, a sequence she'd seen before in forensic work she'd done for a client who'd been skimming from his own company for 6 years before anyone noticed. She sat with it for an hour. Then she printed the relevant pages, put them in a folder, and went to find Voss. He was on the phone when she knocked on his office door. He looked at her through the glass, said something brief to whoever he was speaking with, and hung up. "There are 2 sets of books," she said when she came in. He looked at the folder in her hands, then at her face. Something in his expression shifted. Not guilt, not surprise, something more complex than either. "Sit down, Miss Beckett," he said. "Nora," she said. "We've been married for 6 weeks. You can call me Nora." He looked at her for a moment. "Sit down, Nora." She sat. What he told her took 40 minutes and required her to revise her understanding of the Ardent capital accounts, of the Meridian acquisition, and of exactly how many people knew what she was looking at. Some of it was legal. Some of it was in a gray area that depended heavily on jurisdiction and interpretation. A small portion of it was neither. When he was done, she looked at the folder in her lap and thought about Claudine Farr's face during the contract negotiation and the clause they'd removed. "You expected me to find this," she said. A pause. "Eventually. How long have you been waiting?" "Since you mentioned the reconciliation error in the hallway," he said. 6 weeks ago." She looked at him. "That was a test. It was an assessment, Meda. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "A test has a passing grade," he said. "An assessment tells you what you're working with." She thought about that. She thought about the 47-tab spreadsheet, and the second set of books, and the specific way Voss never wasted words. She thought about the fact that she had been in the middle of what she'd assumed was a marriage of convenience for a man who needed to look settled, and was starting to suspect it was something else, or several things else, or possibly she was only now beginning to understand what she'd actually agreed to. "Are you going to explain the rest?" she said, "or do you want me to find it myself?" He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with that not-quite expression, the one she'd catalogued and still couldn't fully name. "What do you think," he said, "would be more useful to you?" She found the rest herself. It took 3 weeks and 4 notebooks full of cross-referenced entries, and one very long Saturday, where she didn't leave the apartment until she had the entire structure mapped in a way she could explain to someone who wasn't her. When it was done, she had a complete picture of what Ardent Capital actually was, which was considerably more than a private equity firm, and also what Dorian Voss actually was, which was considerably more than she'd understood when she'd agreed to 12 months. She thought about leaving. She made a list of reasons to leave and a list of reasons to stay and stared at both lists for a long time. She was good at weighing things. It was the most reliable skill she had. She called Voss at 11 on a Sunday night. He picked up on the second ring. "I found all of it," she said. A pause. "I know. Mrs. Park told me you accessed the final partition yesterday. You have access logs." Of course. She looked at her notebooks, spread across the kitchen table, every page covered in her small, dense handwriting. 5 years of accounting training and 4 weeks of digging, and she understood it now. The layers, the structure, the particular and precise logic of the way he'd built it. It was elegant in the way that certain complicated things were elegant, the kind where you didn't see it until you knew what you were looking at. "The third subsidiary," she said, "the offshore structure. You're using it to move money away from the other organizations." A pause. "Yes. Not into it, away from it." Another pause. "You're the first person outside of 2 attorneys who's understood the direction." She sat with that. "Cole's money. The 2 million is in a recovery account pending the mediation," he said. "Your 106,000 will transfer to you on Wednesday. The rest is being returned to the fund investors." "That's why you were at the wedding," she said. "That's one reason I was at the wedding," he said. She thought about the hallway, the folder, the specific and unhurried way he'd looked at her in the moment before he told her his name. "What was the other reason?" she said. The pause this time was different, longer, the kind where she could tell he was deciding something. "I've had the Ardent accounts reviewed by 3 different forensic accountants in the last 2 years, he said. "All of them missed the reconciliation error." She waited. "I'd read your work," he said. "I wanted to meet the person who built the 47-tab spreadsheet." She sat in her kitchen at 11:30 on a Sunday night and looked at her notebooks and thought about that, about a man who ran something the size of a small country, taking the time to read the work of an accountant at a mid-sized firm because she'd built a particularly thorough spreadsheet. About 5 years with Cole, who had told her she was too careful, too detailed, too Nora about everything. "You could have just called the firm," she said. "I could have," he said. "But you didn't." "No." She looked out the west-facing window. The city at this hour was its quietest self. Not silent, never silent, but settled, the lights steady instead of rushing. She thought about 12 months and how 6 of them were gone, and how the second 6 were going to be different from the first, though she couldn't have said exactly how until right now. "There are 3 more things I need to understand before I can close the full picture," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll have Mrs. Park send you the access credentials in the morning, and I want to be in the Meridian closing meeting," she said. "Not as your wife, as a financial consultant." A beat. "That can be arranged. And the clause about regulators," she said. "I meant what I said in the negotiation." "I know," he said. "I removed it because I meant it too." She nodded slowly, though he couldn't see her. Outside, a light went off in the building across the street, then another. The city kept doing what it did. "Good night, Voss," she said. "Good night, Nora," he said. She hung up the phone and sat for another moment in the quiet of her apartment, with her notebooks and her window, and the list she'd made of reasons to stay. She looked at the list. She thought about the cost of the dress she'd returned, the $412 back in her account, a number she'd checked off a week ago, without quite meaning to. She thought about what it meant to finally be working with someone who didn't ask her to be less than she was. She closed the notebooks and set them on the shelf in order, and the next morning she sent Mrs. Park an email with 14 questions, all of them specific, all of them ones she already half knew the answers to, because that was how she worked, how she had always worked, and for the first time in a very long time, that was exactly what someone needed her to be.